Hello, hello! Today we embark on an exciting journey into the evidence for evolution and the dynamics of populations. By the end of the session, you will understand the impact of various processes on genetic variation and evolutionary change, the conditions necessary for natural selection to occur. You'll learn about different types of selection, and how inheritance, competition, and variation shape evolution. So let's dive in. Let's begin by exploring the impact of different processes on genetic variation in populations leading to evolutionary change. Here, we'll discuss genetic drift, founder effect, bottleneck effect, gene flow, mutation, non-random mating, natural selection, and sexual selection. For your convenience, though, I am going to quickly go through and define each term, and then following this, we can go through examples together. This way you can more easily navigate through this lesson and skip over the concepts you feel you understand really well, and slow down and work through examples that feel a little less familiar. Sound good? Okay, so starting with genetic drift. Genetic drift is the random change in allele frequencies in a population. Something that's important to keep in mind about genetic drift is that the smaller the population is, the more susceptible it is and the greater impact genetic drift can have on that population. Next, we have founder effects. Founder effects occur when a small group of individuals establish or found a new population, and the resulting population usually has, therefore, less genetic variation compared to that original population where they came from. Bottleneck effects refer to the phenomenon that arise from a drastic reduction, a drastic decrease in population size, usually due to natural disasters or human activities. And this also leads to a significant loss of genetic diversity. Gene flow refers to the movement of genes between populations through either immigration or emigration, and it can increase genetic diversity in populations and counteract the effects of genetic drift at times. Mutation introduces new genetic variation into a population, serving as the ultimate source of genetic diversity. Remember, mutations are where we get new alleles from. Now, non-random mating is just as it sounds. It's mating between individuals that is not necessarily random. Non-random mating causes changes in a population's gene pool due to mate choice, or other forces that cause individuals to mate with certain phenotypes more than others. So in essence, any departure from random mating upsets the equilibrium distribution of genotypes in a population. So non-random mating causes changes in a population's gene pool. One common form of mate choice, called assortative mating, is an individual's preference to mate with partners who are phenotypically similar to themselves. Oh my gosh, that dog is so cute! Okay, anyways, another cause of non-random mating could be physical location. This is especially true in large populations spread over vast geographic distances, where not all individuals will have equal access to one another. Some might be miles apart through woods or over rough terrain, while others might live immediately nearby. Next, we have natural selection. This is the one that I'm sure all of you have heard about in one way or another. So natural selection, when we say this, we're talking about individuals with advantageous traits tend to be more likely to survive and reproduce and therefore pass along those traits. So natural selection favors individuals with advantageous traits, leading to the accumulation over time of beneficial alleles and an increase in the frequency of those alleles in that population over time. Natural selection leads to a greater adaptation of the population to its local environment, therefore, over time. Now, this is in contrast to sexual selection. Sexual selection is driven by traits that enhance specifically mating success, often leading to pronounced differences we see in biological males and biological females in a species. So those are our definitions. Let's now dive into some examples We'll be working in the same order as our definitions, so feel free to skip, pause, speed up, slow down in a manner that best assists your learning experience. Sound good? So starting with genetic drift. In a small population of butterflies, there is a random event where a strong wind carries away a few individuals to a distant island, leaving behind a reduced number of butterflies in the original population. This is an example of genetic drift, as there was a random change in genetic variation due to random events. Something important to note about genetic drift, though, is that it has a much greater impact on smaller populations. Let's use this example to kind of break down what I mean. In our example, we started with a population of 6 butterflies. Now, let's say some of those butterflies, 50% of them, have bubbly antennae, where 50% of our butterflies have the normal or wild type antennae. Now, let's say the same random heavy winds blew 3 of our butterflies to that remote, isolated island. By losing just 3 butterflies from our original population, we now have just 3 butterflies left in our starting population, and our frequency of the bubbly antennae trait changed significantly in that population, right? It went from 50% to 33%. But what if our starting population had 20 individuals? We're going to go ahead and note our change down here. Okay, so what if our starting population instead had 20 individuals? Same starting frequencies where 50% have bubbly antennae and 50% have that wild type or quote-unquote normal antennae. And again, the random heavy winds blew away the same 3 individuals, genetic drift. So now we have 17 butterflies in our starting population, 8 of which have bubbly antennae, and 9 of which have the normal, quote-unquote, antennae. So now our frequency of the bubbly antennae trait has changed a lot less dramatically, right? From 50% to only 47%. So you can see how that increase in population size provided some buffering, and therefore genetic drift impacted the larger population size less than that smaller population. All right, next we have founder effects. For this, I like to look at birds, all right? A group of birds colonize or found a new island. The birds that make up this founding population carry only a fraction of the genetic diversity present in the original population on that mainland. As a result, the genetic makeup of the new bird population on the island is significantly different from the mainland population, right? So the founder effect has led to a loss of genetic variation and an altered gene pool in the isolated bird population. Next, we have bottleneck effects. So let's say for this example, we're looking at elephants. A large population of elephants experience a severe drought that drastically reduces the available water and food resources. Many elephants unfortunately die due to the scarcity, right? Leading to a significant reduction in the population size. The surviving elephants, which represent a very small fraction of that original population, will possess a limited range of genetic variation. The bottleneck effect has caused a substantial loss of genetic variation, potentially increasing the population's vulnerability to genetic disorders and reducing their ability to adapt to changing environments as aptly since they don't have as much variation. Now moving on to gene flow. Consider a population of wild rabbits inhabiting 2 neighboring meadows, separated by a river. These meadows are home to distinct genetic variations of rabbits due to natural selection acting differently in each meadow, right? Some traits might be more advantageous in one meadow than in another. Occasionally, though, during drier months, the river runs very low and becomes very shallow, allowing rabbits to hop from one meadow across the river and to the other meadow, where they can then mate with rabbits from the other meadow. During these events, genes from one population are introduced to the other population, aka genes are flowing between populations. So there is more genetic diversity in the next generation of rabbits. And over time, this gene flow helps maintain genetic diversity in both meadows, as traits from each population intermingle. Now, mutation, big one. Within a population of bacteria, a random mutation occurs in one individual, resulting in a new allele that provides resistance to a specific antibiotic. Antibiotics, as you know, usually kill bacteria. But this mutation introduces genetic variation into this population, and if the antibiotic is present and exerts selective pressure, the individuals with the mutated allele will have a higher chance of survival and therefore reproduction, passing on those traits. So mutation is the ultimate source of genetic variation, as new alleles arise through changes in DNA sequences, mutations, contributing to the diversity of traits within a population. Next, we have non-random or assortative mating. In a population of birds, individuals with similar plumage patterns tend to choose, mates with other similar plumage patterns, while individuals with different patterns are less likely to mate with one another. This preference for similar mates is an example of assortative mating, and it can lead to the formation of distinct subpopulations with different genetic characteristics, as certain traits become more concentrated within each group due to this preferential mating. We also often see this in bird calls. Birds that have similar calls to one another tend to mate with one another. There are many reasons non-random mating occurs. One reason is just simple mate choice. For example, female peahens may prefer peacocks with bigger, brighter tails. Now let's move on to natural selection. In a population of giraffes, let's say, there is variation in neck length. Due to environmental changes, the trees that the giraffes eat on, foliage, becomes higher than it used to, and only giraffes with longer necks can reach this food source. The giraffes with shorter necks now have reduced access to food, and therefore lower survival and reproductive success. Over time, the proportion of giraffes with longer necks increased due to natural selection, as the advantageous trait promotes their survival and ability to reproduce, leading to evolutionary change within this population. And now, sexual selection. We kind of touched on this briefly with assortative mating, but in this example specifically, male peacocks have elaborate and colorful tail feathers, which they display during courtship rituals to attract mates. Peahens, the female peacocks, have a preference for males with larger and more vibrant tail feathers. Through sexual selection, the mating choices made by peahens contributes to the evolution of extravagant and elaborate tail feathers in male peacocks. This preference for specific traits in the context of reproduction can lead to the development of exaggerated and sometimes costly characteristics that enhance mating success. Now moving on to part 2, conditions for natural selection.